Alright. Pokemon Sword and Shield f***ing suck. The tree graphics, F-. The storyline,
Hair, whack. It's gear, whack.
and Gigantamax battling makes me wanna kill myself. We're talking lifeless cities, taking candy from a baby level gyms, and an absolute joke of a rival. Off Hop, maybe more so than any Pokemon game in the past, Sword and Shield divided fan opinion like alcohol and gambling divide marriages. So today I'm going to be doing something that many deemed impossible up to this point. I'm going to tell you why I loved Sword and Shield. I think it would be wise to begin by saying that I'm not going to try to convince you that Sword and Shield is some gaming masterpiece, because frankly, that would be impossible. But I do want to point out that there are some things that Sword and Shield got right, especially when compared to other Pokemon games. In fact, Sword and Shield got a lot of things very, very right. But no one wants to talk about that. They'd rather talk about frame rate or tree graphics or game difficulty. But in the famous words of Joni Mitchell and later the Counting Crows, you don't know what you got till it's gone. Which is why when the world replaces really anything with the latest new thing, people end up with feelings of nostalgia. It doesn't matter how impractical or inefficient the previous thing was. Just look at the resurgence of records or even VHS. It's the same reason that although I have an iPhone 10 in my pocket, I still really wish I had my iPod from 2003. These feelings of longing for the past were a big reason why I loved Sword and Shield. Because although I've caught up with the 3DS Pokemon catalog at this point, in 2020, Sword and Shield was the first Pokemon game that I had played in 10 years. Yep, 10 years. The year is 2020, and my generation's version of the Roaring Twenties has begun. The streets are filled with people, and there's an energy in the air. So naturally, I buy a Nintendo Switch and the latest Pokemon game to pass the time. And by the time I got around to purchasing the games, the DLCs had already been released. So while it sucked paying for them, this did mean that I got to experience the full version of the game upon my first playthrough. I didn't have to wait for Game Freak to finish a game I had already paid for like everyone else. And outside of Pokemon Stadium 2, this was my first 3D Pokemon experience. Which, of course, actually made Sword and Shield feel like quite the jump in quality. While everyone was up in arms about the graphics, the difficulty, and the objectively trash story, I was just having a grand old time, completing my first Pocket Monster Pokedex in 10 years. I would occasionally play my copy of Soul Silver and Nuzlocke a ROM of an early game when I was in college, but this was my first proper Pokemon adventure in a decade. I point this out because if anyone watching this video took 10 years off of playing Pokemon, they would probably enjoy playing whatever the latest installment is too. I think this also explains why there are stands for every generation of Pokemon game. Regardless of what you think about Game Freak releasing unfinished games, the general Pokemon adventure is just fun. Even with all the game's shortcomings, time and place matters. And they can influence whether you just like a game or love a game. And I loved seeing the new Pokemon, I loved going on a new adventure, and I loved the warm feeling of familiarity and comfort the game also gave me. Alright, Chapter 2, The Details. I'm calling this chapter The Details to make it seem like it has a lot of depth to it, but really I could just call the chapter The Menus. Now hold on just a second, hear me out. If you're playing through your adventure like we all did as kids, by breezing through the game with your level 100 starter and just dominating everyone, the menu interface doesn't matter at all. But if you're completing the Pokedex, 100%ing the game, and spending hundreds and hundreds of hours flipping through these pages, then yeah, the visual aesthetic and functionality of the menus matters a lot. Do you remember when Scarlet and Violet came out and it took approximately 30 minutes to just switch between Pokemon and the PC? That shit drove me insane. Now I have no way of knowing if this was the case when Sword and Shield came out, because when I got them, the menus were running like a well-oiled machine. But it actually did have a massive influence on my enjoyment and memory of this game. Just look at how bright, clean, and fun these menus are to flip through. To me, this feels like what a real Pokedex would look like and how a real Pokedex would function. Compare this to Scarlet and Violet and Legends Arceus, which I like, but it's a little dark for me. And we have a clear winner. Now let's look at X and Y and Sun and Moon because I have since played those games. While X and Y is probably the most beautiful sort of 3D linear Pokemon game, I still think the Sword and Shield menu aesthetic is better and absolutely functions better. Sun and Moon's interface is creative and fun, but I can't unsee off-centered text. And while I enjoy the fact that the menu interface and text really blend well with Alola, I still think the cleanliness of Sword and Shield's interface takes the cake here. While it may seem like a small detail, I think the menu interface is important to point out because, well, you're gonna be looking at it a lot. When Pokemon inevitably shuts down Dynamax Adventures or eliminates Sword and Shield's compatibility with Pokemon Home, we're all gonna sit around and say, Dynamax Adventures were awesome. If you don't know, Dynamax Adventures is an added feature from the Crown Tundra DLC that allowed you to battle a handful of sometimes very rare Pokemon en route to a legendary Pokemon at the end. You could do this by yourself or online, and the cool part was that you could pick one of the Pokemon at the end to bring along with you, effectively giving people a way to hunt every legendary. But the even cooler part was that each one of these Pokemon had the off chance of being shiny, effectively giving people a way to shiny hunt any and every legendary Pokemon. On top of that, which is fantastic in itself, Dynamax Adventures was pretty mindless to play through. Some people may see this as a negative, but I found this to be very nice. Dynamax Adventures not being the most engaging means that you can turn on your favorite TV show or sport and shiny hunt legendary Pokemon at the same time. Are my brain cells rotting as I do this? Yes. Am I gonna let that get in the way of me catching a shiny Buzzwole? No. When it came to shiny hunting in the wild, people were all mad about the fact that overworld Pokemon didn't show up shiny. But I think it actually made shiny encounters that much more special. Like, I remember gunning it with my bike in the wild area, just speeding everywhere, I'd assume hatching eggs, and I accidentally hit the Pharaoh Seed evolution. He always spawns under the bridge, he's always there. And I was annoyed at first because obviously I'm hatching eggs, and then he spawns red and shiny, and that was obviously very nice. It's not perfect, but shiny hunting has become such a massive part of Pokemon culture, and I really think Sword and Shield gets shiny hunting right in a lot of ways. Okay, I do need to address really every other aspect of this game, even the bad stuff. I won't be going too in-depth, because there are literally hundreds of other videos about this generation's shortcomings, which I'm sure you've seen. Alright, let's start with the starters. Outside of the fact that all 3 of the final evolutions are terrible, I actually really like all 3 starters. But the final evolutions? These are bad, man. I actually wouldn't hate Rillaboom if Game Freak didn't decide to give this guy a drum set wherever he goes. This guy would not be a good hang. This is Michael Scott when he got back from Jamaica.
Feeling hot, hot, hot. Feeling hot, hot, hot.
But I do like the starters, and the middle evolutions are very good. Outside of the wild area, this game is incredibly linear. But the most frustrating part of this game, in my opinion, is the fact that a lot of these towns would have been some of the most fascinating and beautiful in the entire Pokemon franchise. But in the end, Pokemon just didn't flesh them out. So you end up exploring a region that you can see has a lot of potential, but just wasn't given the time to reach that potential. And they could not have been any more blatant about it, because Game Freak put up cones to prevent you from going places. This is literally what we use in real life construction when things aren't finished. It's so ridiculous that I have to respect it, but at the end of the day, it's just another sign that things are unfinished here. Like I said before, I could go on all day about the shortcomings in this game, but I wanted to point out some of the things that it actually does right, because it seems like as time goes by, these are things that we realize as Pokemon fans. Was Sword and Shield perfect? Hell no. Was Sword and Shield good? Well, probably not either.